Your ownership, I think Ed Miliband has shown, to use your phrase, he's shown that he has got balls on these issues. It took quite a lot of courage to stand up to Rupert Murdoch and demand that there be a public inquiry into what went on at the News of the World, and Ed Miliband was the first of the leaders to do that. And he, Evan's not in his party, but I think Evan would agree that throughout this whole process he's held his nerve remarkably firm all the way through. And I think that that shows he's not going to be browbeaten. But you're absolutely right, the political class in this country let Britain down by allowing one person to own 40% of the newspaper market, the largest tabloid on a daily, the largest tabloid on a Sunday, and the two most important broadsheet newspapers, as well as the largest broadcaster by value in the country, which has twice as much money every year as the BBC and yet produces much less programming. So, yes, I think we will. I think we should have a fixed amount of those markets that you're allowed to own, because all of these things tend towards monopoly, and monopoly is bad. Incidentally, the Mail doesn't have a monopoly of truth either. So the Mail doesn't often have truth either.
Thank you. Jean? I think this is a silly fact, really, but I was certainly written off being a Labour advisor when I wrote a formal paper saying, I think you're putting good across media ownership, and I think this is a mistake. And so that was, what was that? It was probably about 1995, 96. I've got a date of it, I have a diary. And it was very clear to me what I kept on doing drafts, and they bounced back to me. And so I wrote a formal letter sort of saying, no, I think what we're saying is you don't want to have cross-media ownership regulation, and I think it'd be better if you told me that, rather than us rebalance. Obviously I've got to choose other things to do with the Labour Party opposition policy vehicles that get amended. So that's, I do think, I do think that actually, curiously, I think we might not be here again if there was, I was part of a thing called the Right of Reply campaign. And all it said, all we wanted actually, was that newspapers, if they really introduced you, would put something back in the same place where you were. There was no litigation, no anything. But if the Daily Mail says I've got 3 heads, and I can demonstrate I've only got 1 head, I think if that's been on the front page, it should have a little thing saying, Jean, as far as we can gather, does actually seem to have 1 head. And that's actually quite a sort of, it seems to be quite a gentle campaign. And it's a real shame that it didn't get there, because actually citizens would, I think, feel in a much more comfortable place with the press if they had that more responsive relationship to the press. On the bigger privacy issue, I think that we are in a very peculiar place about privacy, but I don't think that we should give up our hearts to, and saying that there's a bigger problem, which actually I have a complicated relationship to, doesn't get away from, as it were, where we draw the line on this particular problem. So I see what you're saying, but I don't think it gets, and any of us, I think I've been very aware of that. Particularly, I'm sure I shouldn't use this, but I ran a prize which had a blogging prize. The first winner of that was a policeman called Jack Knight. And he's the only known case of the Times actually hacking the computer. It's absolutely. And the moment I knew how difficult it was to get hold of Jack, because it was very difficult to get hold of him to make sure he was a real person. I couldn't give him a prize. I didn't know he really was a policeman, and I had to keep phoning up chief inspectors, and it was very difficult to get hold of. And I had his mobile. Nobody asked the prize. He gave the prize money to the policeman over the front. He was outed by the Times. Mrs. Jack Knight had not understood, so we had no trouble with her outside. He very nearly lost his job for a set of blogs that were very, very interesting, because they told you what was going on in court, because court reporting was disappearing. And of course the Times said, the Times argument was it was in the public interest, because you could identify the corpse once they'd named his address. You could identify the corpse, but before then you couldn't. And it took nearly 3 years standing beside Richard and an enormous amount of pro bono legal advice that Richard would not have had access to without me, to actually rectify that was something that really did him, could have done him a personal damage. Now, Justice Eady gave a very interesting decision about it, the first part of which I agreed with, but this was done, and we knew that, we knew that you couldn't just get to Richard. So that could have been you writing your blog about being a nurse, or writing a blog about what's really going on in your school. And there was no way of defending, actually, as somebody who was really performing a public service of you. And it was the 3 years that really got my goat. So all they had to say is, yeah, we made a mistake, we did this. We could have perhaps got there, but it took 3 years. So, thank you.
Well, just on this point about cross-media ownership and the need to require politicians to stand up to the press. Okay, now, I don't want a state-run press, but nor do I want a press-run state. And sometimes we're in danger of going down that path. And I made the point about it, and I still want Brendan to reply to the idea that there should be nothing to constrain the press and the owners of the press from doing as they wish. That an American situation where they have, thanks to this law you like so much, Fox News, while we're stuck with the BBC. Okay? I don't want to be in a Fox News land where they can decide the outcome of elections. Okay? I like the idea, in broadcast terms, because there's limited bandwidth, of there being a duty to have balance in the overall output. Okay? And newspapers, clearly, it's wrong to constrain them in respect of partiality. But nevertheless, that's why you need to have a market. You need to have that choice. And that's why it's critical that the public hold the politicians to the requirement to stand up against the press barons. Because the newspapers won't. They are not free to criticise their proprietors. They're not free to criticise their editors. They're not even free to get a quote from the other side of the argument on a topical issue like Leveson, when their own self-interest is wedded to one part. It's bizarre that that is what some people think is the beautiful free press of the world. It isn't. Well, the question I was asked, I'm not sure which independent body you're talking about.
The recognition body.
The recognition body. Well, the Commissioner for Public Appointments is an independent person. Okay? He appoints an appointments commission which cannot have any politicians on it. Okay? And it also can't have people who are editors. Okay? And they, although they have people with an interest who understand what's needed, and they appoint people to be the recognition panel who can't be politicians of any kind, okay? And nor can they be representatives of the industry, okay? Editors, for example. So they are independent. So there's 3 levels at which the politicians are not involved. And if they feel that any of those stages, the appointments commission or the appointment recognition panel, is not independent, they'd be breaching the rules, and they would be capable of being a judicial review. So you have judges. It's a 3rd layer of independence. So that's not the problem.
No, I just was wondering who are these wonderful independent
Well, there are people who are
they good citizens, or they're great good? Who are these people exactly?
So if you read Schedule 1 of the Royal Charter, which you'll see that that they are to be determined independently. If I knew who they were, then clearly the appointments commission hasn't been put together, then it wouldn't be working. Now, under the press's view, the first recognition panel would be pressed off. We should be the representatives of the owners of the newspapers. That's their idea of an independent recognition panel, which is a nonsense, obviously, but that's what they said, hadn't been fairly rejected after 5 months of consideration. So no, I don't think there's any worry that they'll be independent, and there's certain requirements. So one of them must have legal understanding, one of them must grasp the Scottish situation because it extends to Scotland. Someone must have, at least one, must have an understanding of consumer rights. But their job is to audit any self-regulator that voluntarily puts itself forward. So I'm not so concerned about this. Finally, there was this question about the limits of privacy. I mean, again, I'd like to ask if he thinks that the newspaper should have the right, if it found them, to publish the medical records of any family member of his, even against their will, if they were sent to that newspaper and they were of interest to the public, because they were salacious. Because if not, then clearly media freedom isn't absolute then. I'm asking, should there be some redress for that, or not?
Thank you.
Well, a couple of things. Just in relation to the question of who will be on these panels, it won't be citizens, it will be the great and the good. It will be people like, I suppose, like Evan and his friends who decided, not over pizza, but over something, how the press should be stitched up.
No,
and people like Shami Chakravartis and the Leveson panel, the kind of people who get on TV, who have influence, who are well paid, who have comfortable lives. It won't be the man in the street, I can guarantee you that. In relation to a couple of things, just when Evan says that Fox News decides elections in America, think about what that means. Just think about it in a bit of detail, because I think that really reveals the kind of contempt for the public that people who want to control the media have. Because actually there is something in between Fox News' reports, which are often ridiculous, and the outcome of an election in America. And that thing in between is the voters, the public, the electorate. And what people like Evan really mean when they say Fox News decides the elections in America, or what people in Britain mean when they say it's the Sun that won it, it's the Sun that...
It's the Sun that contended. It was the Sun that won.
Right, but if you... I'm talking about... Wait, hold on. I'm talking about the interpretation of that headline and the use of it by numerous Labour politicians and Labour sympathisers to justify why they kept losing elections in the 90s. Let me finish my point. What these people mean is that the public is incapable of making its mind up and is like an automaton who is filled with ideas by the media. This is the kind of contempt that always drives attacks on press freedom, is the idea that the man in the street cannot cope with hearing certain ideas.
Should broadcast news be allowed to lie about whether Barack Obama is a Muslim, for example?
Or should they be allowed
I'm asking you.
Okay, I'm asking you a question. Should newspapers be allowed to lie about the idea that News of the World journalists deleted Millie Dowler's phone messages? Should they?
I don't think legally you're allowed to talk about that at the moment.
Well, I don't care about that. Right, I wanted to make
that is about, so you don't believe in contempt.
I'm coming on to that question. I want to make a few more points. I want to make a few more points about some of the questions that were asked. So this is driven by contempt for the public, and attacks on the media are always driven by contempt for the public. That's the overriding force, the idea that we cannot interpret stuff and we have to have it interpreted for us by experts. A couple of other things. On the right, your question about the right to reply, and well, what does an individual do if he's harassed by the press? I actually think there should be some form of right to reply. But it's not a simple thing of saying, let's just have it. It's a complicated question because I don't think politicians should have the right to tell you where the reply goes or how big it should be. Or, as Chris quite shockingly suggested, what other journalistic material can go around it. These are politicians who tell us that they didn't want to hear.
I didn't say that.
These are politicians.
You just lie, don't you?
Wait, these are politicians.
You lie.
You said
I
that
didn't
you said when they put
you
said when they put apologies in the press, they cannot put other things around.
You said I said politicians should be able to determine what goes in the newspaper.
The independent self-regulator.
Right, the great and the good. Okay, fine. The great and the good should be able to determine the size and the content of the rest of the page, and they don't want to interfere in the press. Give me a break. Right, a couple of other. You just said that you want a small group of unelected people to dictate to papers what can surround an apology. And you are telling us you don't want to interfere in the press.
I think we should elect judges. No, I'm a bit confused. First you're against elected people
right.
having any power, I agree.
I do think
then
we should.
Unelected people like judges should also not have any power. The only people are the unelected.
I do think we should elect judges. Right, okay. A couple of other things I want to come back to on these questions. Just briefly. On the question of privacy, I think privacy is a very important value. Right? To listen to politicians, especially Labour politicians, talk to us about privacy rights is enough to make you want to cry. These are the politicians who put CCTV cameras everywhere in Britain. These are the politicians who passed the Regulation of Investigatory Powers Act, which codifies when the state may spy on citizens, and which has been used, for example, by local councils to photograph people to to make sure they live in the school catchment area they claim to live in. These are the politicians who have introduced criminal records checks for every adult, 10 million adults who work with children, so you can check their backgrounds to see if they are paedophiles.
That's good, isn't it?
For these
Is that not good?
politicians,
Is that not good?
for these
You would abolish criminal records?
yes, I would. For these politicians, well, if you talk to voluntary organisations around the country and listen to them about how that hampers the ability of adults to work with children, you will see why it's a very poisonous thing. So what I'm saying is, for politicians to talk about privacy rights, for politicians to lecture the media about invading other people's privacy, is absolutely bizarre. We live under a political class which has no respect for people's privacy, particularly the privacy of the underprivileged and the poor, and what Cameron calls chaotic families, but what the Labour government called nasty neighbours or antisocial families, and so on. My final point, just very quickly, sorry, is on the question of the public interest, because we hear this phrase again and again. Yes, of course, journalists should be allowed to break the law if it's in the public interest. I'd like to ask who defines what's in the public interest, because I can guarantee you it will not be the public. It is never the public. And you often actually hear the phrase, what is in the public interest is not the same thing as that which interests the public. So, in other words, the public interest is some rarefied category that exists on some higher plane that has nothing to do with the public. If you look historically at this phrase, the public interest, and where it comes from, firstly from the federal papers, which in America, which were used to kind of hamper the constitutional rights and so on, right from the federal papers through to intellectual thinkers of the 20th century, the public interest has always been something defined by small groups of people as what the public should be interested in. It is a highly elitist phrase, so I would just encourage you to think carefully and critically whenever you hear the phrase the public interest.
And I'd like you to come back to the question you said you would, which is should. I'll put it in English terms in case Fox News and Barack Obama are too abstract for you. Should Sky News be able to say at election time or in the run-up to election that Ed Miliband, this is the presenter, Ed Miliband hates Britain, or he's a Satanist, or something like that. Something that isn't true, but is a matter of their opinion. Well, right, factually inaccurate, or their opinion. Or should we have rules that say that broadcast media, news programs, as opposed to purposes on them?
But you seem to think that if...
That's a simple question.
I'm answering.
Don't tell me what I think, I'm asking you what
I said you seem to think that the media can do the craziest things and it will have no impact, and that the readers or the watchers won't respond to that. This is where I want to come back to something that Chris said earlier on about Hillsborough. No, I'm answering it in this fashion. Something that Chris said earlier on about Hillsborough, and the idea that they had no redress for the awful lies that were told about them by the Sun until later, and when they were given assistance and so on. That's actually not true. There was an extreme and strong, and I think quite progressive, public reaction against what the Sun did, and its business in Liverpool collapsed, and it still hasn't recovered. Because the audience, and by the by, the Sun didn't invent these lies, it was told these lies by the police. The police were shooting.
Well, actually by Conservative
and MPs. So the public is perfectly capable of saying, no, we're not having this, we're not buying that newspaper anymore, screw you, that's it, we're over. So they're also perfectly capable of hearing a broadcast company say, Ed Miliband is a Satanist, and thinking to themselves, that is insane, it's not true. So what I'm talking about...
That's just the price we pay.
What I'm talking about is, if you look at Fox News in America, Fox News talks a lot of rubbish, talks a lot of nonsense, I'm sure lots of it's not true, but that can be said for a number of media outlets in America and in Britain. Not just the tabloids, but also the more respectable broadsheets. What I'm talking about is trusting the public to be able to read things and see things and hear things and work out for themselves if it is true, if it's accurate, if it's useful, if it's not useful, if it's worthy, if it's crap.
It's all advertising, isn't it? What's the point of... Because we have rules on advertising. So the Advertising Standards Authority, quasi-self-regulated, it's co-regulation. So if they don't sort it out, there is a statutory stage. They do not allow false claims to be in advertising. Now, by your lights, that's a complete waste of time because no one can be duped, okay? No one can be duped, and the advertising industry, multi-billion dollars, is wasting its time. Yes, I can. It certainly can be duped. Well, if I read a claim on a medicine, for example, that said that this was clinically proven to cure my, that's a bit personal, sorry, speaking aloud, but and I spent money on it, then I would be angry if I found that that was a lie, because I don't have the time. Like, I personally have the inclination, I don't have the time to go to the medical journals to look at the references. So I think it's right that vulnerable people, by which I mean patients, not me, so if we're talking about even more serious conditions, there are a few more serious than no problems, but there are some, should have the right to protection.
Okay, well I go back to my, I just want to say one thing, it's very important. I go back to a great liberal hero of mine, John Stuart Mill, of the 19th century, which was also a period in which there was a lot of quackery, rubbish science, pseudo cures that didn't work. And his response to those things was not to say we need more regulation or bans. He was so committed to freedom of speech that his argument was you need to publish more questioning, critical material that demolishes those arguments. You don't go running for outside external authority. And just for Evan to defend the Advertising Standards Authority, it's quite interesting considering that earlier on he was talking about blasphemy laws. A couple of years ago, the Advertising Standards Authority banned an advert for GHD shampoo and hair colours and everything else because they offended Christians, because they showed women dressed as nuns praying. That is the resurrection, no pun intended, of blasphemy through a supposedly neutral body like the Advertising Standards Authority. I would encourage a bit more critical thinking about all these bodies that supposedly protect us, the public, from wrong information, because they are often censorious.
Thank you. We are quickly running out of time. I know there's some more questions. I'm going to, so lady there.
Thank you. Viv from Spiked Online. I'm not sure I can fit in the box, but okay. Brenda's actually probably said what I wanted to do, but I thought one of the things you said was really revealing to me, because it seems like that one of your prominent arguments is to take a moral high ground on people like me believing press freedom no is no but, because you're for public interest, you're for the victims, and we're for the posh priorities that got all this, Murdoch going on and all this. And I just wanted, but bear with me, I've actually found this quite excruciating debate, so I'm on board and angry. I thought it was illuminating when you said Wills, when he wanted to go into Parliament and get press into Parliament, the MPs didn't want the press to go in because they're bad. They wanted the MPs to be left alone so that they could talk to each other without getting their heads chopped off. Now, in a sense, I can understand that. But what's illuminating is that actually, instead of the MPs thinking, actually, we'll go out to the people, because at that time they didn't really believe in the people, and they thought they were a bit dead, didn't they? They didn't want to have the buttons. They thought that we're the ones that we should be having a debate about it, and you should just be out there. And I think that's illuminating, because being back right now, and Brendan is right about there is a contempt for the public. You don't mind sticking up for us if we're victims and we need your help. But I actually do believe that press freedom is really, really important for public interest. And it's not so they can get away with doing murder, because there's laws involved in that they don't have to get away with doing murder. But I do think press freedom, no it is, no buts, are really, really important. And we will never convince each other. And, rudeness, to the right of the table, fair enough, do what you need to do. But you haven't even argued and made me think that you're thinking of somebody like me. I know I work at Spiked Online, but I'm no journalist and no writer. I'm ordinary. And it is important for me to know that the press can write about pretty much anything. And if I don't want to buy that paper or read that website, I won't.
Thank you.
Look, I want to ask a question, but what is our model of a typical person? Sorry, Evan, do you want to say something?
Sorry? Free speech. So
Just when I'm speaking, it's like that speaking. Anyway, the point that I was going to make is, what is our model of a human being today? I mean, do we trust them to be rational and to be able to think for themselves or not? Because if you did trust a person to think for themselves, you would accept Fox News and Foxland and all that. I was insomnia. or a lad, and in the middle of the night, in the early hours of the morning, I sit and watch Fox News, and we laugh at it. You know, at the moment, the stuff there is 13 ranting on about Obama, it's actually funny, it's ludicrous. But guess what? Obama won the last election. So there's a lot of American people who obviously, you know, take the channel to pitch itself, watch a different channel. The point about it was somewhat one. Anybody with a titter of sense knows the Conservative Party won the election and Labour lost it. Labour's policies just weren't good enough at that time. The British public went elsewhere. Do we really think that the British people are just these robots and fake dupes? And we can go on and we can go on. So the point I really want to get at is, and by the way, on the Miliband point, surely we want to defend the right of the paper to say, never mind Ralph, but Ed Miliband hates Britain. That's got to be part of the cut and thrust of political debate. Of course, what's going to happen is most British people will probably laugh at that claim. But do we really want to go down the line where we say people can't make these assertions in the press? Because surely that is very dangerous, and that does restrict freedom.
Broadcaster was the question, still unanswered, that I asked Brendan. Should a broadcaster editorially be allowed to say that? Not a polemicist on the broadcaster, but the news presenter.
Absolutely, yes. And can I just say, maybe it's because I come from West Belfast, but I grew up, you know, broadcasters and everybody else, the things that they said about the Republican community where I came from, you know, time after time went largely unchallenged. I didn't like it. But as it happens, if you believe in freedom, surely you have to accept these things. I mean, my last sentence has got to be this. To me, this debate's actually less about the press and more about what is our model of the ordinary human being. And if you start from the start with what we think are rational and capable of thinking for themselves, they're not going to be damaged or messed up or, you know, forced down some cul-de-sac and they end up making crazy decisions and voting for wacko parties. The average British person, average American, average Irish person is fairly capable of thinking through what they read in the media and hear in the broadcast media as well.
Thank you. One last question, and I'll ask Thomas to answer that very briefly.
It wasn't quite a question, sorry. I'm a student from Bournemouth University. It wasn't quite a question, just more an observation really. I thought it was really interesting, thank you. Kind of about the idea of having more press freedom. I think I'm probably the youngest person in the room. I'm 19, so kind of from my perspective, I've kind of grown up with kind of this has happened as I've come through my politics like learning, as it were. So Leveson has been in the centre of what I've been learning at the moment. And actually, the idea of more press freedom actually kind of scares me, because I think some of the things that the press have been kind of unearthed that they've done through the Leveson process and everything, it's actually quite terrifying that if I was in that position, or Lily Darling's parents, or one of the celebrities being hounded by the press, I think I quite simply wouldn't want the press to stop. Like, it's quite simply awful. But then I also understand your opinion that you can't shut down the press because there are certain things that need to be unearthed. Sure, fine. However, I think the complete difference between your opinions is really fascinating. Thank you. It just kind of stirred up some different things. But I think the idea of having a freer press and the idea of having incorrect things put in the press, I think that you kind of trust the press, like you were saying about medicine. You trust the press to be giving you something that you can actually agree with and you can kind of trust that is true. It's been investigated, it's kind of been verified, there's sources that have kind of said this is okay. However, at the same time, there is still press coming out with complete and utter codswallop.
Thank you. I'm going to give panelists a very brief chance to have a few last words. So I'll start with Chris.
Fifth, ordinary people. Well, actually, my whole... Sorry? Well, I thought you said something right. Okay. Well, my interest in this whole thing, in this whole subject, happened when I was first elected, and the local newspaper actually ran a story about a girl, a 12-year-old girl at one of the schools in my constituency, and they ran something about her health, which they had no permission from the family to do. It was about her HIV status, and it destroyed the girl's experience at school. Now, there's no libel, there was no, at the time the privacy legislation was non-existent virtually. She had no...
Do you think I'm going to say, oh, well, sod the victim, sod hers? This is what I'm
Well,
saying.
no,
What
you
are
asked
you
me
doing?
to, you
What
asked,
are you doing?
you asked me to say, is there any ordinary person that this is about? And I'm saying that this often is about ordinary
Yeah, you
people.
come back to saying
That's
there's
what
victims, and of course there's victims. And
Yes,
I don't
well,
want to see victims,
but-
but there is a recourse for that.
But there isn't a recourse for that. For that person, there is no recourse. There was no recourse. We went to the
That's
PC.
shit journalism.
They went-
So let's
All right,
come
yes.
back- No, I'm sorry.
If you
can't
just-
turn even-
But there was no recourse. They went to the PCC, and the PCC said no, fine. They didn't.
So argue about shit journalism.
No, but I am arguing about
Why
shit journalism.
why
That's exactly what I'm
regulate
doing. I'm saying
But why do you
it's
take
an
that
irresponsible journalism, and you need a system to make sure that there's some kind of recourse for people like that, and also so that journalists aren't forced to write that stuff by editors. That's the other problem. And what really upsets me is that people have talked about the Millie Dowler case. The honest truth is that I could cite you another 50 people who had lost people in the armed forces in Afghanistan and had their phones hacked, were caught up in the terrible events in London, in the bombing in London, etc., 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 were attacked by somebody on Clapham Common. All of these things, and they just became a commodity for somebody to earn a living off. And that's what's at the base of the problem for me. And I'm sorry if that sounds horribly left-wing, but I just don't think that people's lives should. I don't think that people's. If you talk all the way through when I'm talking, I can't hear you, I'm afraid. But I just don't think you should commodify people in that way. And yes, you're absolutely right. Brendan is right about one thing. 30% of people in the 1992 general election thought that the Sun was a Labour newspaper. So, people take different things, and sir, I think that's broadly the point that you're making about Fox as well, that in a sense people they end up making their own judgments. But the thing is, if you have no means of correcting lies, blatant untruths, it is phenomenally painful for people. I don't mind all that much about the lies that are written about me. There's so many lies that have been written about me, I've sort of given up. And I just sort of hope that people, through the mosaic of the lies, don't have